Syria is not Syria without this whole spectrum, the whole mosaic of the Syrian ethnicities and the religious sect. So, as I said, it depends how far the Kurds want to go with the backing of the Americans, and I hope that our colleague is accurate in his analysis, that we are going to end, that the end of the war is coming soon, because there could be another round of war in order to force the Kurds to come to negotiation tables, because we need them to negotiate with the Syrian government to find a common solution, because there are many mutual grounds between us and with the Kurds, especially in the fight against terrorism. I don't understand why should any part of the Syrian society has to have its special status among the other communities in Syria.
I come to Jens first, because Kevork speaks about the Kurds. We Flemish, we know that Kurdish question, because in Flanders there is a lot of sympathy for Kurds.
It's something that's typical for the Flemish movement. They support everybody who wants to be independent, but it's something cultural also. We as Flemish also have struggled with our identity, our language struggles against the French bourgeoisie. So if we see another people who wants to proclaim their own independent state, we feel sympathetic to it. But it's much more, the situation in the Middle East is much more complicated than we think. We should be thinking twice before we support any kind of separatist movement.
Coming back to you, the Kurdish question is connected with the position of the Americans in Syria. Once ISIS is defeated, what will the coalition of the West now fighting against ISIS, what will they do? Will they leave?
When you speak about the Kurds, it's a bit of a complicated issue. You have the Kurds in Iraq,
I know.
You have the Kurds in Turkey, in Iran, and in Syria. The Kurds in Iraq tried to divide the country and try to establish...
They had a referendum.
Yes, they had a referendum. And that was a test for the Kurds in Syria as well. And the experience of the referendum failed. And they saw how the coalition of different countries and the international community did not support the Kurds' partition of Iraq. That was a very premature move, and ISIS is still in the Middle East. So they made the wrong step by declaring an independence too early. And that example set the example also for the Kurds in Syria. The Americans will not stay in Syria. They have to leave. First, because they were not invited, as I said earlier. Second, because the government of Damascus has a lot of influence in the Kurdish area, from Kamishli down to, I mean, you go from Kamishli to Efrim, from the far northeast to the far northwest. And there are many allies of Damascus who are ready to fight the Americans in Syria.
You really believe that the Americans will fight further on against Assad and the Assad regime?
Exactly. This is why they're not going to fight. They have to leave. They have established so far 13 military bases, of which 2 main airports, but they can't stay in the country because they are in a hostile environment. The government of Syria wants the energy resources that are under the control of the Kurds, and Damascus will not let go of these resources. They are vital for the survival of the country and for its economy, particularly in this moment. And I don't think the Americans will go to war against Damascus forces. They're not going to go to war against the Iranian forces, who are helping the Damascus troops on the ground, and they're not there to start a new war. Therefore, as soon as the Americans will express their intentions to leave the country, then I think there is a solution between the Kurds and Damascus. And there is already a lot of talk going on between the Kurds and Damascus, because the attempt of the Kurds in Iraq failed. And they have learned the lesson, and they know that the Americans don't have allies, they have interest. And their interest is not to stay in the Levant, particularly in Syria. They are in Iraq, and that is sufficient.
What's the difference between the situation of the Russians in Iraq, in Syria, and the situation of the United States, like you just told?
The Russians were invited in September 2015 to fight against terrorism and to re-establish the control of the regime and to prevent a regime change in Syria. The Americans came to Syria and Iraq to fight against ISIS. If ISIS is in control of 3% of the country, they have no more legal reason to stay. They're no longer covered by international law. Therefore, they have to leave.
Is the election of President Trump, was that for Syria a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, when you say Trump and good, that doesn't match.
Okay.
So Trump is not a decision maker in relation to foreign policy because he simply doesn't know anything about foreign policy. So I still remember the day he bombed the Shayrat military base.
Yes.
And that same evening, he was on the television, and they asked him, why did you bomb Syria? He said, well, last night, I was eating a very nice chocolate cake, and I gave the order to bomb Iraq. And the journalists say, did you bomb Iraq or Syria? Oh, say, yeah, Syria. So he doesn't know which country he's bombing. Therefore, he has no clue about the Middle East policy. Of course, the policy in the Middle East is very complicated. For the moment, the US administration is running the show, and that is static, regardless who is the president. At the moment, the American administration doesn't want to go to war with anyone else. They're happy to bomb from the sky. They're happy to offer intelligence services. They're happy to send special forces and use local forces, but they're not going to start a war against anyone.
The Russians were invited by the government of Syria, but they saved the government of Syria. Without the Russians, Damascus would have fallen. Assad would have lost the war.
This is a rhetorical question. We don't know the answer if the Syrian government was going to collapse or not. But unfortunately, when the US, under the President Obama, they declared the US campaign to fight terrorism in Syria, after the campaign, ISIS was expanding in Syria and not diminishing. They even occupied Palmyra under the watch of the American planes. They came all the way from Deir ez-Zor and from Raqqa to occupy Palmyra. And actually there was leaked voice recording for John Kerry. He was meeting with the opposition figures in Washington, and one of the opposition figures, he recorded the meeting and leaked. And John Kerry was saying that they saw the advancement of ISIS from Palmyra to Damascus as a positive thing in order to put pressure on President Assad to make concessions. The Americans were using, I'm not saying they created ISIS, but they used this power with fighting the Assad government in Syria in order to practice pressure on President Assad. On the other hand, the Russians came in September 2015 at the invitation of the Syrian government in order to crush the backbone of these terrorist organizations. Not only ISIS. We always speak about ISIS as the brutal and the strong military force that is terrorist and so on. But there are other terrorist groups in Syria. For example, Al-Nusra Front in Idlib. The United States, until this moment, they are not committed to fight Al-Nusra. They didn't declare that they will fight Al-Nusra like they do now with ISIS. We have Islam's army. We have Ahrar al-Sham. We have Suqur al-Sham. We have tens of terrorist groups in Syria. They have similar ideologies with different flags and different names. So the Syrian people, in my opinion, they are moderate people. We say 70% of the Syrian people are Muslim Sunnis, but 70% didn't rose against President Assad. If 70% of the people rose against Assad and they wanted to create a caliphate, Assad would have gone within weeks in Syria. And until this moment, the biggest rate of the deaths among the Syrian army officers are from Aleppo. And Aleppo is 90% are Sunni Muslims. That means the Sunnis are fighting with the President Bashar Assad also against these foreign-backed terrorists who want to impose Wahhabi nature of Islam in Syria, the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam in Syria. For example, in Aleppo, I don't know if everybody knows here, when these rebels were occupying eastern Aleppo, and in the Western mainstream media they were saying that Eastern liberated Aleppo, but at the same time the people were suffering in this area. For example, if you don't pray on the Fridays, in the Friday prayer, they will lynch you in the streets. Kids were beheaded, people were burned in the ovens, but nobody spoke about this issue in the media. So the people, even those who were against Assad in 2011, 2012, 2013, they understood the nature of the war in 2017. And if you put today President Assad and all other alternatives, they will choose Assad above anybody else, because Assad his political system is autocratic. Everybody knows this. It's not Switzerland in Syria, but this guy, he presented the cultural rights, the economic rights, free education, and free healthcare for the people. And President Assad, he proved that he is able to manage this country for a long time. The state institutions were functioning very well, and the economy was growing before the war. The GDP was increasing dramatically, and the Syrian lira was very strong in front of the dollar. Before the war, every dollar was 50 Syrian pounds. It's now 500. 500, it's 10 times, 100 times, I don't know, 10 times, I'm not good in math. Yeah, but so the people want to go back pre-2011 situation. It's not going to happen. This is illusion. It's not going to happen. But at the same time, we need to preserve the minimum level of security in Syria in order to create our version of democracy in our country. People believe in the West that if, not all of them of course, but those who are in control of the governments, that if they exported their version of democracy to Syria or to Iraq or to Egypt, it will work. It won't. We are not Europeans, we are not Americans, we are different people, we have different cultures, we have different values. We have to create our